Hi folks, welcome to the wrap up for February 2025. As usual, I'm going to review each of the books that I read in the order that I read them. I'm going to rank them mercilessly, and then at the end I'll declare a book of the month. But first, let's cover a couple that didn't quite make the finish line. I had started Sinners by Pat Cadigan towards the end of January and thought it would just run into February, but in the end I quickly decided, once February got going, that I was going to give up. I found it heavy going and slowly ground to a halt, maybe a third into it. I've since heard that this is not an uncommon feeling at this point in the book, but that it does redeem itself, for some at least, in the second half. But up to that point, I found the plot thin on the ground. There's no detectable narrative drive, and the characters all seem to blend into one. They're not really very differentiated. The atmosphere was well done, though, I thought, but very few books survive on that alone. I might well go back to it at some point, and I do have another couple of hers on the shelves, and I will try not to prejudge those based on this one alone. I forgot that February is a shorter month than typical, and I didn't take that into account when I was selecting my TBR pile for the month. I ran out of time, and there were two books that were still left unread at the end of the month, and they were Accelerando by Charles Stross, of course, which is a big disappointment. I was looking forward to that. And then The Carpet Makers, which I was saving until last, and I just ran out of time. So those aren't DNS, I didn't even start them, so they go back on the shelves, and they live to be read another day. All right, how about the books that I actually finished in February? First up, I listened to Simon R. Greene on audiobook, and this was an absolute romp of a book. It's space opera, very much so. It's suitably epic. It covers all of the bases. I think that Simon Greene throws the kitchen sink at it. There's an evil galactic empire, there are imperial star cruisers, bounty hunters, dodgy bars, fights, swords even, blasters, spaceships, alien relics, actual aliens, cyborgs, espers, clones, mutants, vampires, and yes, werewolves, and there are hackers, a plucky underground movement, a fallen unlikely hero and his band of merry men and women. It's either shamelessly derivative or it's a deliberate homage to the space operas that have gone before it, or it's an utter piss take of all of the above. I really couldn't decide. Maybe it's a little bit of all three. Simon Greene's style, I think, is arch. It's a dry humour which sort of worked for me. It's not laugh-out-loud hilarious. It's more of an underlying tone, a rhetorical flourish, an under-the-breath remark from a character or a concealed thought. I generally think that humour and science fiction are a corny combination, but this was sufficiently subtle that it worked for me. Owen Deathstalker is the scion of an old family, one of the great families of the Empire. Despite his ominous family name, Owen, the current head of the house, the Deathstalker, is a lover, not a fighter. He's a historian by trade. Nonetheless, he's abruptly declared outlaw by the Empress, the so-called Iron Bitch. His family holdings seized and a price put on his head. He has to make a run for it, not knowing why he's been deposed. His flight into the dodgier corners of the Empire, pursued by Imperial starships, is at first desperate and alone, and then he starts to accumulate a gang, which snowballs into a nascent rebellion as the book progresses. You've heard this tale before. Like I say, it's covering familiar territory. I did, however, have tremendous fun. It's not to be taken too seriously, and I think I'll definitely read on. There are several other books in the series. For sheer fun factor, I give Deathstalker 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next up, I read Orphans in the Sky by Robert Heinlein, one of the earliest, if not the first, generation Starship tales. Originally published in Astounding magazine in 2 parts in the early 1940s, it was published in book form like this in 1963. The Vanguard, the generation ship of the piece, has been drifting aimlessly in interstellar space for years, for decades, ever since a mutiny amongst the crew killed most of the officers. Things have since degenerated. Routine shipboard tasks have been degraded into religions or rituals, and their purpose and origins long forgotten. So forgotten that the inhabitants of the ship now believe that ship is the whole universe. They don't see it as moving through space. How could it? The ship is everything. There can't be an outside of the ship. This is now dogma, and to suggest otherwise is heresy and might well get you killed. In this book, we follow Hugh Hoyland, who's a curious, intelligent young man who's been apprenticed to a scientist, really a keeper of the rituals. And exploring the upper reaches of the ship, the low G floors, Hugh is captured by the muties, the mutants or mutineers possibly, who live there. Narrowly escaping being eaten, he's instead enslaved by Jojim, the 2-headed mutant leader of a dominant mutie gang. They get on well though, and Hugh and Jojim gradually become aware of the true nature of ship and the purpose of its voyage. Now all they have to do is persuade everyone else. It's a swiftly told tale. It's a slender book and done in just over 100 pages. It's sharp, it's lean. Heinlein's prose is no nonsense and it's a brisk read, and it's easily done in a single sitting if you put your mind to it. I liked it. I did find myself thinking that it's been done before, and then remember this is the origin, the ur-text. It's a tale oft repeated. Many a generation ship story has been told over the years, and many are imitating Heinlein, but not necessarily improving on it. For its brevity, for being amongst the first of an enduring plot theme, and for being an exciting read, I give Orphans in the Sky 8 out of 10. It's another stellar splendour, and that's a really strong start to the month. Next, I read Downward to Earth by Robert Silverberg, and this, I think, is up there with my favourite Silverbergs. We follow Edmund Gunderson, who's returning to Belzegor after an 8-year absence. A former Earth colony on which Gunderson was an administrator, Belzegor has been relinquished or returned to the native species, now recognised to be sentient and worthy of self-determination. Gunderson is racked with guilt associated with his treatment of the Nildoror while he was an administrator. The Nildoror are the elephant-like natives, their beastly appearance relegating them to physical tasks like carrying and moving heavy stuff. In particular, Gunderson regrets preventing a group of Nildoror from travelling to the Mists, another region of the planet, for their rebirth ceremony, instead diverting them at gunpoint with menaces to help with some urgent flood defence. Gunderson is looking for some form of redemption or forgiveness, and ultimately for transformation and possibly transcendence. I really liked Silverberg's descriptions of life on Belzegor, and I think that's a particular strength of his. In fact, I think that all of the books of his that I like the most have that world building as a leading component of the story. I thought that the Nildoror were done well. It could easily have been a little bit silly to have green elephants as the alien, but I think that was sort of the point that Silverberg was making. Can we humans see beyond physical appearance and recognise the intelligence and the community and the grandeur of the Nildoror, despite their possibly somewhat comic appearance? As the story progresses, Gunderson understands more and more about the Nildoror and their way of life, in particular, the importance of that rebirth ceremony. There's more than a hint of Conrad's Heart of Darkness in this book. There are similarly vivid descriptions of the upcountry jungle, and there's even a character called Kurtz who's gone native, and the central theme is similar, that there's very little difference between civilised people, humans in this case, and savages or the aliens of the piece. I really enjoyed Gunderson's trajectory in this story, his journey to understanding, his redemption and his ultimate transformation. It's a good one and I'm glad to have read it. I give Downward to Earth 8.5 out of 10, straddling the boundary between Stellar Splendour and Galactic Gem. Next up, we're in space opera territory with This Alien Shore by C.S. Friedman. The first wave of human interstellar expansion failed when it became clear that the process of faster-than-light travel had dire consequences at a genetic level on human beings. Mutations, sometimes minor, sometimes grotesque, and all points in between. Panicked on learning this information, Earth abandoned its colonies, leaving them to their fates to deal with whatever form their variations took. Fast forward several hundred years, and interstellar travel is now safe, mostly. The means of doing so is monopolised by the Outspace Guild, who have complete control over the technology. They seem to play it straight, though. Their mission is simply to reunite humanity, reconnecting the lost colonies. Technology in this far future has advanced to the point that every person has a computer installed in their brain at birth, which can be embellished with further brainware as needed as they get older. We're introduced to our main character, Jamesia Shido, a teenage girl, as her world falls apart. The space habitat that she lives on is under attack and she must flee, helped to an escape pod by her tutor. As the book progresses, we get more information about her background in an experiment by the Shido Corporation. Perhaps as a result of her experiences in the long-running experiment, or possibly from prior traumas, Jamesia has multiple personalities, each effectively acting as a different character in the book as they surface and take control of Jamesia's body from time to time. The story is about Jamesia's flight from various parties, all of whom seek her, as she may hold the secret of interstellar travel, the potential to end the Guild's monopoly. I'd heard really good things about this book and I wasn't disappointed. It's a space opera, no question, but Friedman does some interesting things with it. The variations, the mutations of taking different courses on different planets, and Geren, home planet of the Outspace Guild, has made a virtue of neurodiversity. Several of the secondary characters are from Geren, and we get a good idea how their society works, with many of the so-called challenges that autistic folks face on a day-to-day basis in our world baked into their way of life. And I thought that was fascinating and rather well done. There's a community of hackers, mainly petty thieves and hellraisers, but they're one of the few groups willing to help Jamesia stay one step ahead of her pursuers. I enjoyed the secondary plot thread, which is a race against time to track down the source of a virus which is affecting guild pilots and threatening interstellar trade and cohesion. We get a couple of glimpses into what awaits the unprepared in hyperspace, to what the guild pilots and any who seek to supplant them must face. Overall, I enjoyed it very much, helped by the audiobook narration by Kathleen McInerney, which I thought was pretty good. I give This Alien Shore 8 out of 10. It's another slam dunk stellar splendour. Next, in a sort of whiplash change of scene, I read The Sea and Summer by George Turner. The framing for this one's interesting. At the beginning of the book, we're in a sort of archaeological expedition 1,000 years in our future, and we're among the stumps of formerly tall buildings, the decayed remnants of what it turns out is Melbourne, Australia. One of the party has written a novel, or at least a manuscript of one, based on what she's been able to piece together of how life was in this corner of Australia as things went to shit in the 2060s. So the bulk of the book, The Sea and the Summer, is that manuscript, with one or two flash forwards back to the archaeological expedition peppered in as we go. Runaway levels of automation, of artificial intelligence, have driven ever higher levels of unemployment, with financial security a thing of the distant past. Existence is precarious, society is divided between the haves, the sweet, so-called, and the have-nots, the swill, and all this is against a background of increasingly severe climate change, manifesting itself mainly as coastal flooding. We follow one family, the Conways, as they teeter on the edge. The man of the house loses his job and decides to end it all, sending Mrs. Conway and her 2 boys down to the fringe, a down-at-hill area on the edge of swill territory. The teeming millions of swill live in purpose-built tower blocks, which were built in a hurry as part of the process of managed decline. The Conways live in constant fear of being forced out of their new home into the swill proper. Billy Kovacs is a tower boss, a fixer and black marketeer, a sort of Fagin character. He appears at the Conways' house offering his services in what appears to be a protection racket, and it is, but it's one that the Conways actually need. It's really dangerous in the fringe. Billy Kovacs might be the most interesting character in the book, actually. He forms a bond pretty much immediately with the Conways, taking a particular liking to Francis, the younger of the 2 boys. Recognising Francis's extraordinary ability with figures, he sets him up with Nola Parks, a business associate of him, who has illegitimate black market connections. The story of the Sea and Summer follows the fates of the Conway boys, Mrs. Conway and Billy, as they are buffeted by events. I really enjoyed George Turner's writing. It's an easy read, his prose is very approachable, and the book is well paced. It's almost like a thriller at times. It's the sort of book that you could find yourself unable to put down. It's also smart. The decaying world that he describes is well thought through, it's nuanced. The rather obvious sweet versus swill divide is in fact quite blurred and nuanced, and it becomes clear that what remains of a functioning government sees the future of Australia and of humanity entirely, really, in the far more numerous and more resourceful swill, and not the sweet. The structure of the book is interesting. The framing is part of it, as I discussed earlier, but also the point of view switches chapter by chapter. So we get a different lens, mostly one of the Conways, but also a few of the others that come into contact with them as the book goes on. The picture of decay and deterioration, of encroaching peril in the form of the rising floodwaters is well done. And I enjoyed the rich cast of characters, the way of life in the swill. On the face of it, dirty, unhealthy and poor, but also riotous, happy and much more a community than the fearful swill. I really love this book. I give it 9 out of 10. It's a galactic gem. Next up was Nova by Samuel Delany, a book that I've been meaning to read for ages. And I did finally get hold of a physical copy and it found its way onto my TBR for February, but I actually ended up listening to it on an audiobook. It's not a thick book, so I was done in a few days of sporadic listening. The audiobook, I was pleased to find, is narrated by Stefan Rudnicki, who has a very distinctive voice. He also narrated Lord Valentine's Castle by Robert Silverberg, which I enjoyed listening to last year very much. As I say, he has a very distinctive voice, which adds to the overall listening experience. I found that he does need to work on his Australian accent, though, which is really bad. But fortunately, that only makes a couple of appearances in the book. We're 1,000 or so years in the future, and humanity is split broadly into 3 factions. The Draco, which incorporates Earth, the Pleiades Federation, which is a bit more enterprising, a bit more frontier-oriented, and a bit more highly dispersed. Plus there's the outer colonies, which are even more frontier than the Pleiades. The leading family in Draco are the Reds, who control Redshift, a company that has a monopoly of starship engines, and in the Pleiades is the Von Rays. Nova is the story of a long-running feud, a struggle to break the dominance of the Reds over interstellar travel, which the Del Reys believe will ultimately result in the decline of the much more dispersed Pleiades Federation. Lork Van Ray is an adventuring type, a former Starship racing pilot and veteran of more than one mission to harvest the extremely rare Illyrion from a supernova, and Illyrion is what makes starships travel faster than light, amongst other things. He assembles a crew for his latest attempt, and it's quite an eclectic group, ranging from Mouse, who's a gypsy boy from Earth with a gift for playing a syrinx, a funny kind of musical instrument, to an intellectual with dreams of writing a novel, by this time a long-lost art form, and then there are a cast of other secondary characters as well. Ranged against Lork and his crew are Prince Red and his beautiful sister Ruby, who together will stop at nothing to prevent Lork from breaking their family monopoly. Prince is well drawn. He has a prosthetic arm, which he's super sensitive about, exacting creative and drawn-out revenge against people who make even an innocuous remark about it, even if they're just merely curious. We quickly get the impression that Prince is a rather unstable character. Nova gives us a great window into life in this future, where the advanced science and tech is meshed with the esoteric. Tarot readings are entirely mainstream, for example, and consulted for all sorts of purposes. Delany's prose style is colourful, in this case adding to my enjoyment rather than getting in the way of the story. I really enjoyed it. I give Nova 9 out of 10 for quite different reasons to The Sea and Summer, but it's also a galactic gem. Sticking with space opera, the next one that I read or actually listened to is Stars and Bones, which is book 1 of The Continuance, which is a common setting 4 fairly separate stories, I gather, and there are currently 2 of those, the second being Descendant Machine. In this book, Stars and Bones were about to destroy each other in nuclear fire. The targets are locked and the missiles are in the air. The end is nigh. Fortunately for us, a transcended alien presence is watching us from Jupiter, sort of tutting at the waste of life, but betting that something worthwhile will arise from the ashes. But wait, what's this? A disturbance in the space-time continuum. Yes, just in the nick of time, we've invented wormhole technology, and this clinches the deal. The alien disappears the nukes, and just like that, we're saved. Hooray for humanity. But there's a catch. We have to leave Earth behind. Giant arcs appear in orbit, 1,000 of them, humanity's new home, a fleet that comes to be known as the Continuance. Fast forward several decades and we're introduced to Erin King, who's captain of the Furious Ocelot, a scout ship of the Continuance. Her sister Shay is missing on a routine mission and Erin insists on being part of the recovery team. From here in, things quickly get grisly, with exploding heads, people turning inside out and various other body horrors. Something is out there and some of it returns with Erin and the Ocelot. Across the fleet there's evidence of people disappearing, of people being murdered and then turning up alive again. Is it an infection? Is it an invasion? What's going on? The bulk of the book is Erin and her crew being in the thick of this mess, doing their best to fight it and ultimately to find a resolution. It's space opera and it's pretty efficiently told. I listened to it on audiobook and it was a quick listen, about 5 hours, I think, if I remember rightly. The narration was by Rebecca Norfolk and it was generally perfectly serviceable, but there were some pronunciation errors which really ought to have been caught in the production process. This was a minor distraction overall, but I did find it a little bit jarring, pulling me out of the story on occasion. I liked Erin as a character. Her relationship with Shay's daughter was nuanced, I thought that the ship's sarcastic cat was fun. This was my first Gareth Powell book. I've somehow missed him along the way, although he has several books to his name by this stage and plenty more in the works, it seems. I had a good time and I'll be reading more of his books, I think. I give Stars and Bones 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next, I read Paul McAuley's The Secret of Life, some hard science fiction roughage to add to my space opera diet in February. The book opens with some industrial espionage. Someone is trying to get something out of China, but the plane carrying it away crashes or is shot down perhaps, leaving the critical vial of microbes to fall into the Pacific. But this isn't any old microbe. It's a genetically engineered Martian microbe brought back from under the surface of Mars by a Chinese mission and then tinkered with. It would be a boring old book if that was the end of it, so of course it doesn't just sink into the bottom of the ocean. It forms a fast-growing, ever-mutating slick, ultimately threatening global ecological disaster. Dr. Mariella Enders is a famous scientist, so notable for having discovered the origin of the so-called Moses plague, a previous infection that resulted in a severe reduction in the number of male births. With the new virus Slick spreading, Mariella is seconded to a hastily arranged mission to Mars, racing the Chinese back to Mars to find more life. This is a tale of science being subsumed by corporate interests, of the public interest being ignored, scientific rigour being sacrificed on the altar of future profit. I liked Mariella as a main character. She's spiky and uncompromising, an attitude that gets shit done but makes her some powerful enemies along the way. I particularly enjoyed the quite lengthy section on Mars, although I did find that it ended somewhat abruptly in a rapid evacuation back to Earth for reasons that become apparent when you read the book. The finale is back home on Earth as Mariella tries to keep the samples that she now has out of the wrong hands and to get some worthwhile science done to find ways to stop the outbreak, which have now spread to every ocean. Written in 2001 and set in 2026 and the following 3 or 4 years, McAuley's setting has almost been overtaken by our actual history, which was maybe a little bit jarring, just a little bit difficult to suspend disbelief. I think he was a bit over-optimistic about what we might all have achieved in the 25 years of future that he allowed for the story. Still, it's science fiction and Mariella's world is not actually ours, just rather like it in some respects. I think if you like Kim Stanley Robinson, then you'll find a lot to like in this book too. There's a lot of science, there's some exploration of alternative lifestyles and economic systems and some radical ecologists, all things that Robinson often tackles in his books. The Secret of Life, I think, read more like a thriller than a science fiction tale per se. It moves along at a good pace, the stakes are high, and there is a lot of science in it. But nothing too mind-bending. I enjoyed it and I'm happy to check off another Paul McAuley novel. I still have loads of his work to read. I give The Secret of Life 7.5 out of 10. It's a definite planetary pleasure, trending towards a stellar splendour. Doomsday Book is the first of Connie Willis's Oxford Time Travel Quartet. Now, I've read them out of order. This is the third of the 4 books that I've read, Blackout and All Clear being amongst my favourite reads of 2023. The structure of the book is interesting. There are 2 plot threads mirrored to a degree. One is in 2050s Oxford, the other in the 14th century village of Stengate, just about within the sound of Oxford's church bells. Kivrin is preparing to travel back to the Dark Ages, but Professor Dunworthy is fretting. He believes his colleague Gilchrist, the acting head of the history faculty, has made shortcut after shortcut in the preparation and is concerned, therefore, for Kivrin's safety. Still, back in time she goes, and all appears to be well initially. A celebratory pint is had in the nearby pub, but soon Badri, the technician, arrives, muttering about something having gone wrong. Back to the lab they go, with Badri staggering ahead down a busy high street full of Christmas shoppers. We're about to find out what went wrong when Badri keels over, having come down with something. We might expect Kivrin to be subject to all sorts of 14th century pestilence and disease, although she has been immunised. But instead it's the 2050s that gets the epidemic and the associated quarantine, at least at first. We get the impression that there's been at least one pandemic in recent memory, and the response to any potential repeat is swift. So we get fraught epidemic-related goings-on in 2050s Oxford, with Dunworthy attempting to get someone to replace the gravely ill Badri as tech, to find out what the hell went wrong with Kivrin's time travel. It's the Christmas vacation though, and the students have all gone home, and much of the staff too, and the quarantine makes it extremely difficult to bring anyone back to Oxford. Back in the 1320s, Kivrin has arrived roughly where she expected to, or so she thinks, but she's ill, seriously ill. She's nursed to the extent that anyone can be nursed in the 1320s by the residents of the local manor house. Her translator tech is malfunctioning though, and she can't understand or be understood. What with her fever and raving in a strange language, she's in serious danger of being burnt for a witch. I was predisposed to enjoy the book after my experience with the other two, and I wasn't disappointed. Okay, there are some of the same irritations. At times, Connie Willis insists on placing barrier after barrier in front of her protagonists, and on occasion I just wanted them to be allowed to get the hell on with whatever it was they were trying to do, unmolested. Mainly though, I thought that Doomsday Book was an engaging read. I liked Kivrin and enjoyed her experiences in the 14th century. We essentially get a front row seat to the main event of that time period, the Black Death, and it's pretty harrowing stuff in general, with some particularly poignant scenes which tugged at the old heartstrings. And if you read it, you probably know to what I'm referring. Connie Willis does a ton of research for her books, and it shows, I think, particularly in the 14th century thread. I enjoyed that depth of detail. It makes for a really believable and immersive setting. The 2050s thread maybe suffers a little bit from being written in 1992, before the internet was around, really. And Willis is rather restrained in her predictions about the tech available to Dunworthy and his team, but that's a minor criticism. I liked Dunworthy as a character, and Colin, the great nephew of one of Dunworthy's team, who manages to bust his way through the quarantine to be with his great aunt for Christmas. Colin features large in the two books set in World War II, so I was very happy to see a younger version of him in this one. I listened to Doomsday Book on audiobook, and I thought that the narration was very well done by Jenny Sterling, which added to my general enjoyment. I think she did a good job of bringing the story to life. If you like a good time travel book, if you enjoy the dangers of paradoxes, or even a bit of historical fiction, then I think Doomsday Book should work well for you too if you haven't read it. Overall, I found this to be a really enjoyable book, and that's not surprising, perhaps, given that it won both the Hugo and the Nebula Awards back in the day. I give Doomsday Book 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. A glutton for punishment, I went back once more to the Amarantine spectrum. I read the first book, The Promise of the Child, back in January and was impressed. It wasn't an easy read. It's not a book where you can check your brain in at the front door. Now, having been through that and with a few weeks' rest, I girded my loins for book 2, The Weight of the World, in February. I read the handy 2-page recap that Tom Toner provides and was immediately scratching my head. Really? That's what happened? I had to go back and reread the last 50 or so pages of the first book to settle myself back into the world. We continue on more or less from where we left off. Via multiple plot threads, we explore the exquisitely described universe of the Amarantine Prefecture and the Prism Investiture. Territories ceded to the Prism centuries earlier by the Amarantine. The Prism are a motley collection of variant humans, some not much bigger than your finger, and then the Melius, who can be 9 or 12 feet tall, and all points in between. There are billions or trillions of the prisms scattered across known space on planets, but mainly on hollowed out moons or tethered moons, and all manner of strange, cobbled together almost steampunk spaceships. The Amarantine near immortals are dwindling in number nevertheless, as they either die off or are killed or go insane with great age, and their grip on power is slipping as a result. The far more numerous Prism are snapping at their heels, and there are power plays in progress even amongst the Amarantine. There are, as I said, several plot threads, many with characters recurring from book 1, plus one significant addition that I suspect will grow in importance as Toner closes out the story in the third book. As yet, it's not at all clear what the link is between the characters and the plot threads that they inhabit. There's a distinct lack of connective tissue. I assume, or rather I hope, that this all crashes together in a glorious crescendo in book 3. So it's not for the story, the through plot, that you visit with these books, or at least not yet. At the time that I reviewed it, I couldn't really think of anything to compare the first book to. And the closest that I can now come up with is Book of the New Sun, Gene Wolfe's many-layered masterpiece. There's a similar sense of the deep past, of accumulations of lives and history that we only glimpse or see through the distortions of legend. A similar sense of having no idea where it was going, the strong sense that I might be missing something, and the certainty that a reread or 3 might be necessary. I did enjoy myself. Once again, the world building is something extraordinary. It's dense and rich, lush, weird even, raising many more questions than it answers. I was also a little bit relieved to finish, and for that reason, I give The Weight of the World 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next, also on audiobook, I read Colossus by D.F. Jones, which was published in 1966. Set at some unspecified time in the future, but not too far in the future, Professor Friedman has been running a huge program to build the world's biggest, most powerful and most advanced computer, Colossus. And at the beginning of the book, Friedman warns the president that he's worried about potential side effects, unexpected consequences from switching the damn thing on. And of course, those worries are duly ignored, and Colossus has switched on regardless and handed the keys, no less, to the entire US military, including all of the strategic nuclear weapons. Colossus immediately declares that there's another system like itself, giving coordinates in the Soviet Union, and it quickly transpires that the Soviets do indeed have their own powerful computer, Guardian. Colossus then makes the first of many demands. Connect me to Guardian or else. Bearing in mind that Colossus has its virtual fingers on the nuclear button, these are not empty threats. The book is the story of Colossus/Guardian becoming self-aware, making more and more demands and reducing the scientists of the piece to the role of caretakers. The pesky humans have to figure out ways to outwit Colossus, but that might prove to be extremely challenging. As Friedman says to the president early on, we might have built it better than we thought. One potential weakness to exploit, though, is that Colossus has no concept of human emotion. There are definite Skynet vibes, and with all the AI noise at the moment, a frisson of the familiar too. Colossus, for example, has been fed thousands of novels, plays and poems, published scientific papers, textbooks, and all sorts of other things, all, one imagines, without the copyright consent of the authors. Written in 1966, it's even more dated than Doomsday Book in terms of the tech available to the scientists of the future. Communication with Colossus is via old-school teletype machine, for example. They could invent a giant, all-powerful computer, but not a more effective user interface, it seems. Fortunately, Colossus is well ahead of them and sorts them out, inventing one for himself. Colossus makes bigger and bigger demands with bigger and bigger threats, carrying them out in one or two explosive cases. But what does Colossus want? Well, it's all in our best interests, of course, if only we'd submit to its total control. It's B-movie stuff, really, but it moved along well enough, and it was a quick listen, about 5 hours, if I remember rightly. If you have a copy knocking around, or if you have an Audible account, it's worth a read or a listen, but I don't know that I'd seek it out especially. I give Colossus 6.5 out of 10. It's a nebulous narrative, with promising shades of planetary pleasure. Next, I read Embassytown by China Mieville. Embassytown is about language, about the constraints and restraints that puts on our thinking. It's about truth and lies, and it's also about the dangers of addiction and the all too fragile boundary between order and chaos. Embassytown is a human enclave in an otherwise alien city on the planet of Ariaka. The Ariaka, or the hosts, are unable to comprehend our speech, and we suspect that they don't even recognise our monkey noises as speech, as communication. Avis Benacho, the ABC of the story, a human, is our narrator and protagonist, our guide to Embassytown and the hosts. When she was young, Avis was created a simile, a living element of the host's language. In a ceremony that she only dimly understands and remembers even less well, she becomes the girl who was hurt and ate what she was given. Before she can understand the language, she's forever part of it. Being something but not something, like it but not it, is not just incomprehensible to the hosts. Their brains just can't do it. They know only literal truth. They cannot lie, no matter how innocuous the form of that lie, a simile or a metaphor, for example. Humans are perhaps uniquely qualified to teach them how to lie. Our language is built to do it. It's hardwired into us. Ambassadors are bred or developed. They're pairs of identical twins or clones, and they're empathically linked. Trained to speak simultaneously to mimic the speech patterns of the Arike, who have double tongues. Finally, we can communicate with the hosts, or at least some of us can. Bremen, the distant polity of which Embassytown is a colony, sends a new ambassador, one not a result of the local programme. Ezra, as Ez and Ra, looks very different from the off. They're not identical twins for a start. Their Laurel and Hardy appearance generating much in the way of disquiet and discussion. Their first attempt at communicating with the hosts goes badly wrong. Something is subtly wrong with Ezra's speech pattern, the result of which is a linguistic narcotic high, a mainlining of speech heroin directly into the brains of the nearby hosts. They are, unfortunately, instant addicts with highly destabilising effects. The whole place rapidly goes to pot, putting the dependent human population of Embassytown at severe risk. Think of the most drug-blighted neighbourhood you can, your worst fever dream of deprivation, wasted people that forget to eat, hollow eyes, desperation, violence, and then multiply it by 10 and extend that to the very fabric of the neighbourhood. All the result of some well-meaning attempts to shortcut a carefully created communication mechanism. Embassytown is the tale of this fall and the many attempts to rectify the situation, with Avis increasingly at the centre of it all. She's no longer a mere simile, she becomes a power broker in her own right. I really love the language of the book, the craft of it. It's not an easy start. Mieville bombards us with new words, invented words, borrowed and merged words. The context gives us clues, but we're mainly left to figure it out. I thought it was very clever. Not that kind of arch, annoying kind of clever, the performative clever. It's not too clever for its own good. I think it's the good kind of clever. The only thing I can think of to compare it to is Stories of Your Life by Ted Chiang, which was the novella that became the movie Arrival. There's a similar theme of language constraining thought patterns, and they're both similarly well done, I thought. I think it's marvellous, and I thoroughly recommend it. I gave Embassytown 9.5 out of 10. It's a galactic gem. All of which means that my book of the month, by a hair's breadth, is Embassytown by China Mieville. As always, thank you ever so much for watching, and until next time, goodbye for now.